Dust swirled across the cracked earth of Amos Caldwell's ranch, carried by a wind that whispered of drought and forgotten promises. For 15 years, nothing had stirred the stillness of his Montana plains except the lowing of cattle and the creak of his weathered barn. Amos had chosen this life, carving out a sanctuary from the chaos of a past he'd buried deep. But on that blistering August afternoon in 1995, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, a stranger shattered his solitude. There she was, slumped against the splintered gatepost of his property line, her blouse torn, blood seeping into the dirt. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a fragile thread tethering her to life. Amos stood frozen, his shotgun resting loosely in his calloused hands, 30 yards from the woman who'd stumbled into his world. Amos Caldwell, a man of 58, had built this isolation with purpose. After the accident, after the whispers of blame that clung to him like ash, had fled the small town of Elkwood, leaving behind neighbors, friends, and the ghosts of his former life. The fire that claimed his wife and daughter had left scars deeper than the ones on his hands, scars that made solitude his only refuge. No visitors, no letters, no trace of the man he'd been. His ranch, 10 miles from the nearest paved road, was a fortress of quiet, its only residence Amos, his cattle, and the memories he kept locked in a steel box beneath his bed. He'd learned to live with the silence, even to crave it. But now, this woman, her presence a jagged tear in his carefully stitched existence, Cyprian to unravel. Everything. She was young, maybe 30, with auburn hair matted with sweat and grime. Her hands clutched her side, where blood had darkened the pale fabric of her blouse. She hadn't noticed him yet, her eyes shut tight against the pain, her face pale as the alkali dust coating the ground. Amos's first instinct was to turn back, retreat to the shadowed safety of his cabin, and pretend he'd never seen her. In his experience, strangers brought trouble, and trouble was the one guest he'd vowed never to entertain again. He'd seen what came of meddling accusations, suspicion, the kind of pain that didn't fade with time. Yet something about her stillness, the way her fingers twitched against her wound, held him in place. He took a step forward, then another, the shotgun still a weight in his hands, a reminder of the distance he meant to keep. When his shadow fell across her, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were hazel, sharp with pain, but alive with a fire that caught Amos off guard. She tried to speak, her lips parting, but only a faint rasp escaped. He crouched down, keeping the shotgun across his knees, close enough to see the bruises blooming along her cheekbone, the shallow cuts crisscrossing her forearms. Someone had hurt her, and badly. Her voice came again, faint but urgent, cracking like dry leaves. "Please, they're after me." Those words sliced through the air, sharp and heavy, shattering the fragile peace Amos had spent 15 years cultivating. If someone was after her, if someone was hunting her, his sanctuary was no longer safe. Whether he helped her or sent her away, the choice would drag him back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. His mind raced, calculating the cost of involvement. He could leave her here, let the plains swallow her story as they'd swallowed his. Or he could help and risk everything he'd built. But as he met her gaze, those hazel eyes burning with fear and defiance, he felt something shift inside him, a crack in the walls he'd spent years reinforcing. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Dust clouds could hide riders, and the plains stretched endlessly, offering no cover. She tried to sit up, wincing as the effort tore at her wounds. "Men from Blackthorn Hollow," she managed, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "3 of them, maybe more. They've been chasing me since last night." Blackthorn Hollow. Amos knew the Placia rough settlement 30 miles west, a haven for miners, drifters, and men who thrived in the shadows of lawlessness. It was a place where questions were dangerous and answers were paid for in blood. If she'd fled from there, she was either running from a crime or running from something worse. "What did you do?" he asked, the words sharper than he intended, honed by years of solitude and suspicion. Her eyes flashed with something like anger, though pain dulled the edges. "What makes you think I did anything?" she snapped, her voice gaining strength. "People don't end up bleeding on my gate with killers on their tail for no reason," Amos replied, his tone flat but unyielding. She looked away, her jaw tightening, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, so softly he had to lean closer to hear. "I saw them kill a man, a prospector named Harlan Tate. He found something in the Hilsa claim worth more than his life. I was there, delivering supplies to the general store. Wrong place, wrong time." Amos studied her, searching for the telltale signs of a lie. In his old life, before the ranch, he'd been a deputy in Elkwood, trained to read people, to spot the flicker of deceit in a glance or a hesitation. But her eyes held steady, and the tremor in her voice spoke of truth, not fabrication. "So you ran," he said, not a question but a statement. "What else could I do?" she replied, her voice breaking. "They burned his body to hide the evidence. They saw me watching. You think they'd let me live to tell anyone?" A sound broke the momentous hoof beats, faint but growing louder, a rhythm that set Amos's nerves on edge. He stood, shotgun ready, eyes locked on the horizon. There, a dust cloud, maybe a mile out, moving fast toward his ranch. For riders, just as she'd warned. She struggled to her feet, gripping the gatepost for support, her face pale but resolute. "Please," she whispered, "I don't want to bring you trouble. Just point me to water, and I'll keep moving." But Amos was already calculating. For men, likely armed, desperate to silence a witness. If they'd tracked her here, they'd see the blood on his gate, the signs of her presence. They'd see him. His isolation, his carefully guarded peace, was already compromised. The hoofbeats grew louder, a relentless drumbeat closing the distance. In less than 10 minutes, those riders would reach his property, and Amos Caldwell would have to decide whether 15 years of solitude was worth dying for. He made his choice in an instant, not out of bravery or recklessness, but because he recognized the look in her eyes, a haunted, desperate resolve that mirrored his own from years ago, when he'd stood alone against a world that judged him guilty. "Can you walk?" he asked, already moving toward her. She nodded, though her grip on the gatepost suggested otherwise. "My name's Eliza Monroe," she said as he steadied her, his arm supporting her weight. "Amos Caldwell," he replied, "and we're about to get real familiar with my storm cellar." The cellar was his failsafe, a hidden bunker beneath the barn floor, stocked with canned goods, water, and a few medical supplies. He'd built it after the fire, a place to hide if his past ever came calling. He'd never imagined using it for someone else. As they stumbled toward the barn, Eliza's legs buckled, and without thinking, Amos scooped her up, carrying her the rest of the way. She was light, fragile in a way that stirred something long buried in him, a protective instinct he thought he'd lost. The hoofbeats were close now, the sound of multiple horses, ridden hard, echoing across the plains. Inside the barn, Amos set Eliza down and pried open the concealed trapdoor. The cellar was cramped but functional, its shelves lined with enough supplies to last weeks. "There's bandages down there," he said, helping her down the ladder. "Patch yourself up and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." Eliza grabbed his arm before he could close the door, her eyes searching his. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. Don't know if I'm telling the truth." Amos paused, meeting her gaze. "Maybe I know what it's like to run from something you can't fight," he said quietly. "Maybe I know what it's like to have nowhere left to go." Before she could respond, he shut the trapdoor, sliding a hay bale over it to conceal the entrance. The riders were almost could hear the creak of saddles, the snort of horses pushed to their limit. Amos checked his shotgun, loaded with buckshot, and moved to the barn's open door, positioning himself where he could see the approach. For riders crested the rise, their silhouettes stark against the fading sun. Hard men, their faces weathered by sun and sin, fanned out as they neared the ranch. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his forehead, raised a hand, halting the group 50 yards from the barn. Even at that distance, Amos could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the kind of look that belonged to a man who'd killed before and would again without hesitation. "Caldwell," the scarred man called, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Name's Virgil Kane. We're tracking a woman, a thief and a liar. You seen anyone pass through here?" The lie was obvious, a test to see if Amos would play along or betray himself. He stepped into the doorway, shotgun held low but ready, his face a mask of calm he didn't feel. Haven't seen a soul in months, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the weapon in his hands. Gets quiet out here. Suits me fine. Kane's eyes narrowed, scanning the property with predatory precision. His gaze lingered on the gatepost, where Eliz's blood had dried into dark streaks against the wood. Funny thing, Kane said, dismounting with a fluid grace that spoke of experience. We followed her trail right to your land. Blood trail, too. She's hurt bad. His men spread out, not overtly threatening, but positioned to cut off any escape. Amos recognized the tactic used it himself in his deputy days, cornering men who thought they could outrun justice. Blood could be anything, Amos replied, keeping his tone even. Coyotes roam these parts. Could be she ran into something with claws. Kane's smile was thin, humorless, the kind that preceded violence. Mind if we take a look around? Just to set our minds at ease. It wasn't a question. Amos could see it in the way Kane's hand rested near his revolver, in the way his men watched his every move. They'd search the ranch whether he agreed or not. The only question was whether they'd shoot him first. Free country, Amos said, stepping aside, though his grip on the shotgun tightened. Just don't spook my cattle. They're all I've got. As Kane approached, Amos noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Clay caked on the man's boots. The same clay found only in the hills round Blackthorn Hollow, where Harlan Tate had staked his claim. Eliz's story held weight, and Kane was no ordinary tracker. He was a killer, and the blood under his nails suggested he enjoyed it. Nice spread you got here, Caldwell, Kane said, his eyes sweeping the barn, the cabin, the open land. Quiet, private, the kind of place a man could hide something or someone. Just a rancher, Amos replied, his voice flat. Don't need to hide anything, Kane chuckled, a sound like gravel underfoot. That's what they all say. But you know what I think. I think you've got secrets, Caldwell. I can smell 'em. One of Kane's men called out from near the gate. Virgil, found fresh tracks of me own moved through here today. Amos's heart sank. Those were likely his own tracks from checking the fences that morning, but Kane wouldn't know that. And in his current mood, he'd assume the worst. Thought you said no one's been here, Kane said, his hand inching closer to his revolver. I said I hadn't seen anyone, Amos corrected, his finger resting lightly on the shotgun's trigger. Didn't say I hadn't been out myself. Checked the fences this morning. Found some posts down, probably from whatever left that blood. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken threats. Kane's smile returned, colder now, and Amos knew the man was weighing his next move. The moment hung in the balance, a fragile thread between peace and violence. Then Kane stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and crossed a line Amos had drawn years ago. No one entered his sanctuary uninvited. Let's take a look inside that barn, Kane said, his hand now openly on his gun. Amos raised the shotgun an inch, not a threat but a warning. I'd rather you didn't, wasn't asking, Kane replied, his men closing in, their hands ready on their weapons. The standoff was seconds from erupting into bloodshed when a new sound broke the tension. Hoofits, fast and urgent, coming from the east. A lone rider, pushing his horse hard across the plains, appeared on the ridge. Kane cursed under his breath, his attention split between Amos and the newcomer. In that moment of distraction, Amos caught sight of something worse. Of Kane's men. A weary tracker named Hollis was studying the ground near the barn, following a trail of faint blood droplets leading toward the door. The rider pulled up, his horse lathered and heaving. Virgil, he shouted. Trouble in Blackthorn. Sheriff sniffing around Tate's claim. Someone talked. Kane's face darkened, his eyes narrowing to slits. What kind of trouble? The kind that ends with a noose if we don't clean it up. The rider replied, his voice tight with panic. For a moment, Amos thought the news might force Kane to abandon his search. But then Hollis spoke up, pointing at the ground. Blood trail leads to the barn, Virgil. She's here. The words hit Amos like a hammer. His lie was exposed, and for armed killers stood between him and the woman he'd chosen to protect. Worse, they were desperate, cornered by the threat of justice closing in. Kane drew his revolver with a speed that spoke of practice. Bring her out, Caldwell. Do it now, and maybe we'll make this quick. But Amos was already moving, years of instinct kicking in. The shotgun roared, and Hollis dropped, clutching his leg as blood sprayed the dirt. The shot echoed like a thunderclap, turning the quiet ranch into a battlefield. Kane dove behind his horse as Amos's second shot splintered the gatepost where he'd stood. The other two men scattered, one diving for the water trough, the other sprinting for the barn's sidewall. Amos rolled behind a stack of hay bales, his heart pounding, but his hands steady. The old deputy in him waking from a long sleep. "You picked the wrong fight, Caldwell," Kane shouted, firing a wild shot that tore through the barn door. "All this for a woman you don't even know." Amos didn't answer, saving his breath for the fight. He put a round through the water trough, forcing the man behind it to scramble for cover. The rider who'd brought the news had already fled, his horse kicking up dust as he raced back toward Blackthorn. Smart move. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Amos counted shots, calculated angles, and tried to remember every trick he'd learned as a deputy facing down outlaws. Two men left besides Kane, both with clear shots at the barn if he broke cover. Then he heard the creak of the trapdoor opening. "No," he hissed, but Eliz's voice came through, weak but resolute. "I can help. I can shoot." "Stay down," Amos snapped, but she was already climbing out, clutching his spare revolver from the seller's supplies. Her face was ashen, blood seeping through her bandages, but her hands were steady on the gun. Kane's laugh cut through the air, sharp and cruel. "That's it, girl. Come out and finish what we started at Tate's place." Eliza crouched beside Amos, her eyes burning with a fire that belied her injuries. "They killed Harlan's son, too," she whispered. "A boy, barely 10. Shot him because he saw them. I couldn't save him." The words hit Amos like a gut punch. A child murdered for greed. This wasn't just about protecting a stranger anymore, it was about righting a wrong. That couldn't be undone. "How many rounds?" Amos asked, his voice low. "5 in the gun, 6 on the belt," Eliza replied, wincing as she shifted her weight. Amos checked his shotgun. 2 shells left. Against Kane and 2 seasoned killers, it wasn't enough for a fair fight. But then he remembered the old dynamite in the barn, left over from clearing rocks years ago. Dangerous, unstable, but enough to change the odds. "Can you keep them pinned for a minute?" he asked. Eliza nodded, sweat beading on her forehead. "What's the plan?" "Something reckless," Amos said, his eyes on the barn's far corner. He looked at Eliza, a woman he'd known for less than an hour, who'd dragged him back into a world he'd fled. She could have stayed hidden, let him face this alone. Instead, she'd chosen to fight. "Ready?" he asked. She braced herself against the barn wall, revolver steady. "For Harlan's boy." Amos sprinted for the barn's side door as Eliza fired, her shots forcing Kane and his men to duck. The open ground was a death trap, 30 yards where any of them could take him down. A bullet grazed his shoulder, burning like fire, but he kept moving, diving through the door as another shot splintered the frame. Inside, he scrambled to the corner where he kept the dynamite, a small crate marked with warnings he'd ignored for years. 2 sticks, fuses brittle but intact, enough to turn the tide or blow them all to hell. He grabbed the matches, his hands steady despite the chaos. Outside, Eliza's revolver fell silent, was either reloading or hit. Amos lit the first fuse, the spark hissing like a snake. 20 seconds, maybe less. He sprinted back to the door, dynamite in one hand, shotgun in the other. Eliza was still alive, crouched behind a barrel, her face pale but her gun ready. She saw the sparking fuse and understood. Kane's voice rang out, taunting. "Give it up, Caldwell. You're outgunned." Instead of answering, Amos hurled the dynamite toward the water trough where Kane's men hid. The stick arched through the air, fuse burning bright. The explosion shook the earth, sending dirt and debris skyward. When the dust settled, one man lay still, the other was crawling, dazed and bleeding. But Kane had used the chaos to move. He was at the barn door now, revolver aimed at Eliza's head. "Drop it, Caldwell," he growled, his face twisted with rage. "Or I end her." Amos froze, shotgun halfway raised. At this range, Kane couldn't miss. Eliza met Amos's eyes, and he saw not fear but resolve. "Don't let him win," she said, her voice steady despite the gun at her temple. But Amos had one card left, second stick of dynamite, lit and hidden behind his back. It rolled to a stop at Kane's feet, the fuse burning low. Kane's eyes widened, caught between shooting Eliza and diving for safety. He chose wrong. The blast threw him back, his revolver flying into the dust. When the smoke cleared, Kane lay still, his reign of terror ended. Amos stumbled to Eliza, who was slumped against the barrel, alive but fading. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Amos surveyed the Rekigeus barn scarred, his sanctuary shattered, blood soaking the ground he'd called home. "Not yet," he said, helping her stand. "But it will be." The dust still hung in the air, thick with the acrid scent of dynamite and blood. As Amos Caldwell helped Eliza Monroe limp toward the cabin, the ranch, once a haven of silence, was now a battlefield, its peace shattered by the violence that had erupted just minutes ago. Virgil Kane lay dead near the barn, his body crumpled in the dirt, and one of his men was motionless by the blasted water trough. The other, wounded but alive, had crawled off into the fading light, likely hoping to escape the wrath of Amos's shotgun. The young rider who'd brought news of trouble in Blackthorn Hollow had long since fled, his horse a distant speck on the horizon. But Amos knew this wasn't over. Eliza's words there after Micho'd in his mind, a warning that more trouble could be coming. For now, though, he had to keep her alive and figure out what came next. Eliza's weight sagged against him, her strength fading with every step. The blood seeping through her makeshift bandages had darkened, and her face was pale, her hazel eyes dulled by pain but still sharp with determination. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they reached the cabin door. "I didn't mean to bring this to you." Amos didn't reply, his focus on getting her inside. He kicked the door open, the familiar creak of its hinges grounding him in the chaos. The cabin was sparse wooden floors worn smooth by years of solitude, a single table, a stove, and a cot in the corner. He eased Eliza onto the cot, her breath hitching as she settled. "Save your apologies," Amos said, grabbing a tin box of medical supplies from a shelf. "We're not out of this yet." He knelt beside her, pulling out gauze, iodine, and a needle and thread. Her wounds were worse than he'd thought, a deep gash on her side, likely from a knife, and a fresh graze on her arm from the gunfire. She'd lost too much blood. An infection was a risk out here, miles from a doctor. "This is gonna hurt," he warned, pouring iodine onto a cloth. Eliza nodded, gripping the edge of the cot. "Do it." As he cleaned and stitched her wounds, Amos's mind raced. The men from Blackthorn Hollow hadn't come for Eliza by chance. She'd seen them murder Harlan Tate and his son, a crime tied to a claim worth killing for. That kind of secret didn't die easily. And if Kane's crew was desperate enough to track her 30 miles across open country, others might follow. Amos had spent 15 years avoiding trouble, building a life where no one asked questions and no one came looking. But now, trouble had found him, and he was neck deep in it. Eliza winced as he tied off the stitches, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You didn't have to do this. You could have turned me away." Amos kept his eyes on his work, avoiding her gaze. "Didn't have much choice. They'd have come for me anyway once they saw your blood on my gate." It was half true. He could have lied, sent her on her way, and hoped Kane's men believed him. But something in her ice fear mixed with defiance had stirred a part of him he'd thought long dead. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, after the fire that took his family. The look of someone who'd lost everything, but refused to break. "What now?" Eliza asked, her voice soft but urgent. "They'll send more. Blackthorn's got no shortage of men who'll kill for a cut of that claim." Amos stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "First, we keep you alive. Then we figure out who's left to come after you." He moved to the window, peering out at the darkening plains. The bodies of Kane and his man lay where they'd fallen, stark reminders of the line he'd crossed. He'd killed before, in his deputy days, but that was a different life. This felt personal, like he'd been dragged back into a fight he'd spent years running from. The night passed in tense silence, Amos keeping watch while Eliza rested. He'd moved her to the cellar again, just in case, but no riders came. By dawn, the plains were quiet, the only sound the distant lowing of his cattle. He led Eliza out of the cellar, helping her to the table where he set out coffee and hardtack. She ate slowly, her movements careful, but her eyes were clearer, the fire in them burning brighter. "You're good at this," she said, nodding at the bandages. "Not your first time stitching someone up." "Was a deputy once," Amos admitted, pouring coffee. "Elkwood, back before everything. Learned to patch up what needed patching." Eliza studied him, her gaze sharp despite her injuries. "What made you leave it all behind?" Amos's jaw tightened. He didn't talk about the fire, the accusations, the way a town turned on him when grief needed a scapegoat. Bad things happened. Needed a fresh start. She didn't press, but her silence was heavy, like she understood more than he'd said. The morning brought new trouble. As Amos stepped outside to check the damage, he spotted a glint on the horizontal light reflecting off metal. Riders, maybe 3, moving slow but deliberate, a mile out. He ducked back inside, grabbing his shotgun. "More company," he said, his voice low. Eliza's face paled, but she reached for the revolver he'd left on the table. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Too far to tell." She stood, wincing but steady. "I'm not hiding this time. I brought this to your door. I'll face it." Amos wanted to argue, to send her back to the cellar, but the set of her jaw told him she wouldn't budge. "Stay low," he said instead, "and don't shoot unless you have to." They took positions by the windows, Amos at the front, Eliza at the side, her revolver ready. The riders approached, their shapes resolving into 3 men, armed but not as rough as Kane's crew. The leader, a weary man with gray hair and a badge pinned to his vest, raised a hand as they stopped 20 yards from the cabin. "Caldwell," the man called. "Sheriff Amos Tucker, out of Blackthorn Hollow. Need to talk." Amos's grip on the shotgun eased slightly, but he didn't lower it. A sheriff wasn't always good news, especially not from a place like Blackthorn. "What about?" Amos shouted back, keeping his voice steady. Tucker dismounted, his hands visible, no weapon drawn. "Heard there was trouble out here. Found a body on the trail, one of Kane's men. Figured you might know something." Amos glanced at Eliza, who shook her head slightly. She didn't trust Tucker, and neither did Amos, not yet. "Had some visitors yesterday," Amos said, stepping onto the porch, shotgun still in hand. "Didn't take kindly to trespassers." Tucker's eyes flicked to the bodies near the barn, then back to Amos. "Looks like you handled it. Mind if I ask what happened?" It was a trap, Amos knew. Admit to killing Kane, and he could be facing a rope, sheriff or not. Deny it, and the blood on his land would tell a different story. "Coyotes got bold," Amos said, his voice flat. "Had to put 'em down." Tucker's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Coyotes don't carry revolvers, Caldwell. And that blood trail by your gate don't look like it came from an animal." He took a step closer, his men staying back but ready. "Word is, a woman ran from Blackthorn. Witness to a killing. You wouldn't be hiding her, would you?" Eliza tensed behind him, her revolver raised. Amos kept his eyes on Tucker, weighing his options. The sheriff didn't seem like Kane, but that didn't make him an ally. Blackthorn was a town where money talked louder than justice, and a claim like Harlan Tate's could buy a lot of silence. "No one here but me," Amos said, the lie heavy on his tongue. "You're welcome to look, but don't expect to find much." Tucker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll take that look." He signaled his men, who dismounted and spread out, one heading for the barn, the other toward the gate. Amos's heart sank as the barn man, a deputy with a limp, paused at the blood trail leading to the cabin. "Sheriff," the deputy called, "got something here. Fresh blood leading inside." The game was up. Tucker's eyes hardened, and he drew his revolver, slow but deliberate. "Let's make this easy, Caldwell. Bring her out, and we'll talk. No need for more bodies." Eliza stepped forward before Amos could stop her, revolver still in her hand but lowered. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady despite the pain etched on her face. "I'm the one you're looking for." Tucker's gaze shifted to her, taking in her bandages, her defiance. "Eliza Monroe," he said, not a question. "You've caused a lot of trouble. Not as much as the men who killed Harlan Tate and his boy." She shot back. "I saw it all. They burned the body to hide the evidence, but I'm still breathing, and I'll tell anyone who'll listen." The sheriff's face didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something recognition, maybe, or calculation. "That's a serious claim," he said. and a dangerous one. Tate's claim is stirring up all kinds of greed in Blackthorn. Men'll kill to keep it quiet." He paused, holstering his revolver. "But I'm not one of them. I came to find you before more like Cain do." Amos didn't lower his shotgun. "Why should we trust you?" he asked. "Blackthorn's not exactly known for honest lawmen." Tucker nodded, like he'd expected the question. "Fair enough. But I've been after Cain's crew for months. They've been running roughshod over the territory, killing anyone who gets in their way. Tate wasn't the first, but he might be the last if you'd help me." Eliza glanced at Amos, uncertainty in her eyes. "He could be lying," she whispered. "Could be working for the men behind Cain." Amos nodded, his mind racing. Tucker seemed straight, but he'd known sheriffs who'd sold their badges for less than a silver claim. Still, they were out of options. The blood trail had given them away, and more men could be coming. "What do you want from us?" Amos asked. "Testimony," Tucker said. "Eliza's story, in court, under oath. We've got a judge in Blackthorn who's not bought yet. With her word and what's left of Cain's crew, we can bring down the men pulling the strings." He looked at Amos. "And you, Caldwell, word is you used to wear a badge. You know how this works. Help me, and I'll make sure you're both protected." Amos didn't like it. Protection was a promise easily broken, and Blackthorn was a long ride through hostile country. But Eliza's hand on his arm steadied him. "I'll do it," she said. "For Harlan's boy. He deserves justice." Amos met her gaze, saw the resolve there, and knew he couldn't walk away. "Not now." "All right," he said. "But we do this my way. No one else comes near my ranch until we're ready to move." Tucker agreed, and they spent the day preparing. Amos buried Cain and his man shallowly, just enough to keep the coyotes away. Eliza rested, regaining what strength she could. By evening, Tucker's men had scouted the perimeter, confirming no other riders were near for now. But Amos knew better than to trust the quiet. He'd learned long ago that peace was fragile and greed was relentless. That night, as they sat by the stove, Eliza told her story in full. She'd been delivering supplies to Blackthorn's general store when she overheard Cain and his men talking about Tate's climb a vein of silver richer than anything the territory had seen in years. When Tate refused to sell, they'd killed him and his son, a boy named Caleb, barely 10 years old. Eliza had hidden in the store's loft, watching through a crack in the floor as they dragged the bodies to a fire pit. She'd fled when they spotted her, running through the night, stealing a horse to reach Amos's ranch. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice breaking. "I just kept running." Amos listened, the weight of her words settling over him. He'd run to, after the fire, when Elkwood turned on him. He'd lost his wife, Clara, and his daughter, Hannah, to a blaze no one could explain. The town had whispered arson, pointing fingers at Amos, a deputy who'd made enemies. He'd left rather than fight a battle he couldn't win. Now, Eliza's story was pulling him back, forcing him to face the man he'd been. The next morning, trouble came again. Tucker was saddling his horse when one of his deputies shouted from the ridge, "Riders!" 6 of them. Coming fast, Amos grabbed his shotgun, Eliza her revolver, and they took cover behind the cabin's walls. Tucker joined them, his face grim. "Cain's bosses," he said. "They must have heard I'm onto them." The riders were different from Cain's crew, better armed, better organized. Their horses sleek and well-fed. The leader, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a tailored coat, rode at the front, a rifle across his saddle. "Caldwell," he called, his voice smooth but commanding. "I'm Elias Ward, representing the Blackthorn Mining Company. We know you're hiding Eliza Monroe. Hand her over, and we'll leave your ranch in peace." Amos's blood went cold. The Blackthorn Mining Company wasn't just a business, it was a machine, buying land, men, and silence across the territory. If they were involved, Tate's claim was bigger than he'd thought. "No one's here but me," Amos shouted back, buying time. Ward laughed, a sound that carried no warmth. "Don't play dumb, Caldwell. We tracked her here, same as Cain. You've got 10 minutes to bring her out, or we burn this place to the ground." Eliza gripped Amos's arm. "They'll kill us all," she whispered. "They can't afford to let me talk." Amos nodded, his mind racing. 6 men, well-armed, and a company behind them. Even with Tucker and his deputies, They were outnumbered. But Amos hadn't survived 15 years alone by giving up. He turned to Tucker. "You got any tricks up your sleeve, Sheriff?" Tucker grinned, a glint in his eye. "Might have one or two. Got a wagon in the barn?" The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. Amos and Tucker dragged an old hay wagon to the edge of the barn, piling it with dry straw and what was left of the dynamite. Eliza and the deputies kept watch, their guns ready. As Ward's men spread out, preparing to advance, Amos lit the fuse. "Get ready," he told Eliza, who nodded, her revolver steady despite the pain in her eyes. They pushed the wagon toward the riders, the fuse burning low. Ward shouted something, but the explosion cut him off. A deafening roar that sent flames and debris skyward. 2 of Ward's men went down, their horses bolting. The others scattered, firing wildly as Amos, Eliza, and Tucker returned fire from the cabin. The fight was brutal, bullets tearing through wood and flesh. One of Tucker's deputies fell, a round through his chest. Eliza took a graze to her leg, but she kept shooting, her aim true. When the smoke cleared, Ward was gone, his horse galloping into the distance. 3 of his men lay dead, the others wounded and surrendering. Tucker cuffed them, his face grim. "This ain't over," he said. "Ward'll be back with more." Amos looked at Eliza, who was binding her new wound with a torn strip of cloth. "Then we take the fight to them," he said. "Blackthorn's not getting away with this." The aftermath of the fight left Amos Caldwell's ranch scarred but standing, a testament to the violence that had erupted over 2 days. The bodies of Elias Ward's men lay scattered near the smoldering remains of the hay wagon, its dynamite-fueled explosion a grim reminder of the lengths Amos and Eliza Monroe had gone to survive. Sheriff Tucker and his remaining deputy were binding the wounded survivors, their faces set with the weary determination of men who knew justice came at a cost. Eliza sat on the cabin steps, her leg freshly bandaged, her hazel eyes fixed on the horizon where Ward had fled. Amos stood beside her, his shotgun still in hand, the weight of the past 48 hours settling into his bones. They'd won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Ward's escape meant Blackthorn's mining company would come for them again, and Amos knew they couldn't wait for the next attack. "We need to move," Tucker said, wiping sweat from his brow as he approached. "Ward'll be back in Blackthorn by now, rallying more men. If we're gonna stop this, we hit them first." Eliza looked up, her face pale but resolute. "I'm testifying," she said, "whatever it takes to bring them down." For Harlan and Caleb, Amos nodded, though his gut twisted at the thought of leaving his ranch. 15 years of solitude had made it his sanctuary, but it was no longer Safanat for him. Not for Eliza. "Then we ride to Blackthorn," he said. "But we do it smart." The plan was simple but dangerous. Tucker would take his prisoners back to Blackthorn Hollow, using them as leverage to force a hearing with Judge Harlan Baxter, one of the few men in town not owned by the mining company. Eliza would testify about the murders, and Amos would back her up, his word as a former deputy carrying weight. But Blackthorn was 30 miles of open country, and Ward's men would be watching the trails. They'd need to move fast and stay hidden. A tall order with Eliza's injuries, and only 1 deputy left to help. They left at dusk, Amos's cattle left to roam the pasture, his cabin locked, but vulnerable. Eliza rode beside him on a spare horse, her wounds slowing her but her spirit unbroken. Tucker and his deputy, a young man named Caleb Morse, took point, their rifles ready. The prisoners, 2 of Ward's men with minor wounds, were tied and slung over horses, their sullen silence a constant reminder of the stakes. As the plains stretched out under a starlit sky, Amos felt the weight of his old life returning with instincts of a deputy, the burden of protecting others. He'd run from that once, but not this time. The first sign of trouble came 10 miles out, at a narrow pass where the trail dipped between two rocky hills. Tucker raised a hand, signaling a stop. "Tracks," he whispered, pointing to fresh hoof prints in the dirt. "Recent. For horses, maybe 5. Amos dismounted, shotgun in hand, and scanned the shadows. The hills offered perfect cover for an ambush, and Ward wasn't the type to let them reach Blackthorn alive. Eliza gripped her revolver, her eyes scanning the ridges. "They're here," she said, her voice low but certain. The attack came fast. Bullets cracked from the hills, kicking up dirt around them. Amos dove for cover behind a boulder, pulling Eliza with him as Tucker and Morse returned fire. The prisoners screamed, their horses rearing, but there was no time to deal with them. Amos counted muzzle-flashed 4 shooters, maybe more, positioned high. "Stay down," he told Eliza, who nodded, her revolver ready. Tucker took a hit, a graze to his shoulder, but kept firing, his deputy covering the left flank. Amos moved, low and fast, using the rocks for cover. He'd done this before, in his deputy days, flushing out outlaws who thought they had the upper hand. He climbed the hill, shotgun ready, and caught one of Ward's men reloading. A single blast dropped him, the sound echoing through the pass. The others hesitated, giving Tucker and Morse a chance to advance. Eliza fired from below, her aim steady despite her injuries, and another shooter fell. The fight ended as quickly as it began. 3 of Ward's men were dead, 1 wounded and surrendering. Tucker cuffed him, his face grim. "Ward's running out of men," he said, but there was no triumph in his voice. They'd survived, but the cost was high. Morse had taken a bullet to the leg, and Eliza's wounds had reopened, blood seeping through her bandages. Amos tore his shirt to make a tourniquet for Morse, his hands steady, but his mind racing. They were halfway to Blackthorn, and the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Blackthorn Hollow, a dusty town of saloons, boarding houses, and the looming shadow of the mining company's offices. The streets were quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that hid watchful eyes. Tucker led them to a livery stable owned by a friend, a grizzled old man named Jonah who owed him a favor. "Hide here," Jonah said, gesturing to a loft above the stalls. "I'll get word to Judge Baxter. But stay sharp, word's got men everywhere." The wait was agonizing. Amos kept watch from the loft's window, his shotgun never far from hand. Eliza rested, her strength fading, but her resolve unbroken. "I never thought I'd make it this far," she admitted, her voice soft. "Thought I'd die out there on your ranch." Amos looked at her, seeing the woman who'd turned his world upside down. "You're tougher than you look," he said, and meant it. She smiled, a small thing that warmed the cold space in his chest. Judge Baxter arrived at midnight, a tall man with a lined face and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to Eliza's story, his expression unreadable. As she recounted the murders of Harlan and Caleb Tate, the Silver Claim, and Kane's crew, Amos added his account of the fight at the ranch, leaving out nothing at the dynamite. "Not the bodies." Baxter nodded, scribbling notes. "This is enough to hang Ward and his bosses," he said. "But we need to do this public, in court where the company can't bury it." The hearing was set for dawn, in Blackthorn's courthouse, a squat building dwarfed by the mining company's offices. Word spread fast, and by morning, a crowd had gathered: miners, shopkeepers, men and women tired of the company's grip on their lives. Amos and Eliza stood before the judge, Tucker at their side, his shoulder bandaged but his badge gleaming. The prisoners, including the wounded man from the pass, were brought in, their faces pale with fear. Ward was there, too, flanked by company men in suits, their eyes cold and calculating. He denied everything, claiming Eliza was a liar, a thief who'd fabricated the story to extort the company. But Eliza's testimony was unshakable. She spoke of the fire, the blood, the boy who'd begged for his life before Kane's bullet silenced him. The crowd murmured, their anger growing. Amos backed her up, his voice steady as he described the attack on his ranch, the blood trail, the dynamite. The prisoners, facing the noose, turned on Ward, spilling details of the company's orders to kill anyone who threatened the claim. The turning point came when Jonah, the livery owner, stepped forward. He'd found a piece of evidencia ledger from the mining company, dropped by one of Kane's men, detailing payments to cover up the murders. Baxter read it aloud, and the crowd erupted, their shouts drowning out Ward's protests. The judge slammed his gavel, ordering Ward and his men arrested. The company's lawyers tried to intervene, but the crowd's mood had turned, and Baxter's deputies moved fast, cuffing Ward as he cursed and struggled. By noon, it was over. Ward and his men were in cells, the company's power broken, at least for now. Eliza's testimony had sparked something bigger, a reckoning for Blackthorn's corruption. Amos watched as the crowd dispersed, some shaking Eliza's hand. others nodding at him with respect he hadn't felt in years. Tucker clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, Caldwell. Reminded me of the deputy you used to be." Amos didn't reply, his eyes on Eliza. She was exhausted, her wounds still raw, but there was a lightness to her now, like a burden had lifted. "What now?" she asked, echoing her question from days ago. Amos looked out at the town, then back at his ranch in his mind's eye. It was scarred, broken, but it was still his. "We go home," he said. "Rebuild. Start over." They rode back to the ranch the next day, Tucker escorting them partway before returning to Blackthorn. The plains were quiet, the air crisp with the promise of fall. Amos's cabin came into view, its walls still standing despite the bullet holes and dynamite scars. Eliza rode beside him, her strength returning with every mile. "You didn't have to do this," she said again. "You could have stayed out of it." Amos shook his head. "Some fights find you, whether you want them or not." He paused, then added, "And some things are worth fighting for." Eliza smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, Amos felt the weight of his solitude lift, just a little. 6 months later, the ranch was different. The barn was rebuilt, the fences mended, and Eliza had stayed, her hands as skilled with a hammer as they were with a revolver. They worked side by side, raising cattle and planting a small garden, something Amos hadn't done since his wife was alive. Travelers passing through spoke of the ranch where a scarred man and a fierce woman had faced down killers and won. Some came to shake Amos's hand, others to hear Eliza's story. The solitude was gone, replaced by a new kind of pension built on shared scars and shared strength. Amos kept his shotgun ready, but he never needed it again. The company's power in Blackthorn faded, its leaders exposed and jailed. Eliza testified at every trial, her voice carrying the weight of justice for Harlan and Caleb Tate. And Amos, who'd once run from his past, found himself building a future, not just for himself but for the woman who'd brought him back to life. As they sat on the rebuilt porch one evening, the sky ablaze with sunset, Eliza turned to him. "You ever miss the quiet?" she asked. Amos thought of the years alone, the silence that had both saved and suffocated him. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But this is better." She nodded, her hand resting near his, and they watched the stars come out. Two souls who'd found a home in the ashes of violence. What would you have done in Amos's place? Would you have risked everything to protect a stranger, or played it safe and stayed out of the fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the choices we make when faced with violence and injustice. How far would you go to right or wrong? And what does justice mean to you in a world where greed and power often win? Your voice matters, so let us know where you stand.